simultaneous translation, they should tune channel 1. Several years ago, some of us, including some of my friends here, some of us expressed great concern with respect to Iran's growing presence in Latin America, in Venezuela. Later, Hugo Chavez opened doors in the region for Iran's president Ahmadinejad. Eventually, the risks of these developments was recognized by a wider audience and, more importantly, by the administration. Today, very few would call these concerns mere speculation. The fact is that Iran has firmed up its presence in Latin America, and this is highly worrisome. One needs only look back to the horrific bombings in 1992 and 1994 in Buenos Aires to realize what relations with Iran entail. With this background, it's puzzling, to say the least, to observe the Kirchner government efforts for a rapprochement, or as we say in Spanish, un entendimiento, with Iran. Why is this happening and what's behind it are questions that need explanations. In the context of Hugo Chavez's illness, it looks as if others are eager to host Iran in the hemisphere. To analyze this and other related issues, we are privileged to have a panel of star experts that I'm sure will enlighten the regional picture for us. They will speak in the following order. First is Aldo Donsis, a distinguished Argentine Jewish leader. He is the president of DAYA, which is the political umbrella organization of Jewish organizations in Argentina. And he will share with us the perceptions and the facts of what is happening in his country. He will be followed by Douglas Farr, a highly known and respected specialist on Islamist and other movements in Latin America. And then Ambassador Otto Reich is the authority on U.S. policy towards Latin America. After their presentations, we'll have a period of questions and comments. And without any further ado, I turn the podium to Mr. Dances.
Thank you. I feel more comfortable with my Spanish. I'm sorry. Gracias por la invitación a participar en este panel. Para mí es un honor y un privilegio. Así que nuevamente, gracias. Me gustaría pasar primero al PowerPoint. Si lo... ¿Quién lo maneja? Ah. Okay, bien. Bien. Simplemente quería utilizarlo como introducción para entender qué es lo que causa cuando penetra en las sociedades las ideologías fundamentalistas. Desde hace ya algunos años hemos visto en Latinoamérica, principalmente desde Venezuela, que ha abierto en su momento las puertas para que entre una ideología que hasta hace muchos años era ajena a las ideologías, al concepto de sociedades democráticas en Latinoamérica. Y Chávez, el presidente de Venezuela, no solo abrió la puerta, sino que les permitió ingresar de una manera totalmente franca, poniendo un vuelo, una línea aérea, un vuelo que hace Teherán, Damasco, Caracas. Un vuelo que viene directamente a Caracas desde hace ya 4 o 5 años, cuyos pasajeros no descienden en el aeropuerto en Caracas por donde pasa cualquier pasajero que transita de forma turística, sino que pasa únicamente por la sala VIP y nadie sabe quiénes son los que vienen ni qué transportan. Desde hace ya varios años uno quiere sacar pasaje en ese vuelo y siempre está lleno, nunca hay lugar, no se puede sacar pasaje. Pero lo que sí viene ocurriendo desde aquel entonces es que todas las casas diplomáticas iraníes de todos los países de Latinoamérica han ido creciendo de una manera espectacular. En algunos países se han desarrollado mega embajadas de Irán, algunas más grandes que las de Estados Unidos, que ya las de Estados Unidos son grandes en los países latinoamericanos. Algunas cuentan con más de 200 diplomáticos iraníes. Y cuando decimos diplomáticos no es exactamente esa la palabra. En realidad son funcionarios de Irán que entran a Latinoamérica con propósitos diferentes. No vienen con carácter diplomático, sino que vienen a instruir o a captar voluntades para poder transmitir ideologías fundamentalistas y convertirlo en un futuro en células que estén latentes, solamente esperan un mandato para ser activadas. Y ese desarrollo lo venimos viendo desde hace muchos años. Latinoamérica ofrece quizás las posibilidades, algunas débiles democracias o algunas sensibles economías, la globalización, las diversas vías de financiamiento, crimen organizado, narcotráfico, lavado de dinero. Todo eso convierte a Latinoamérica en tierra fértil, exacto, para que un país como Irán, que quiere hacer una penetración ideológica fundamentalista, le sea absolutamente propicio. Y hay básicamente 3 tipos de países. Aquel, el que ignora la amenaza del terrorismo, y por supuesto Irán no le es problema, y privilegia cualquier tratado comercial por encima de una amenaza. Están los segundo países que prefieren cambiar impunidad por inmunidad. Nosotros no te acusamos, pero por favor a nosotros, con nosotros no. Es preferible que vayas a algún vecino, pero no con nosotros. Y están los terceros países que comulgan ideológicamente con Ahmadinejad. Es cierto que también ocurre un mix. Hay algunos países que además de comulgar, privilegian también las relaciones comerciales. Y hemos visto en este caso cómo se comporta Latinoamérica. Ayer viajó una misión de el ALBA. Quien encabezaba era el canciller de Venezuela, Maduro, que en nombre y en representación de todos los países que componen el ALBA, sumados a Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Cuba, Trinidad, San Vicente, Barbuda, Granadinas, viajaron a Siria para ofrecerle solidaridad a Assad. para que no vuelva a ocurrir lo que ellos llaman la invasión del imperialismo, para que no vuelva a ocurrir lo que ocurrió en Libia. Este es el comportamiento que hoy está teniendo Latinoamérica y que tiene este permisismo, el que permite que esta circulación dentro de los países de la región puedan trabajar sin ningún tipo de problema, haciendo el reclutamiento. Eso es lo que hacen seguramente estos supuestos diplomáticos iraníes. Y lo digo con esta seguridad, porque en el año 94, en Buenos Aires, en el atentado a la Mutual de la comunidad judía en Buenos Aires, donde se planificó el atentado, fue la embajada iraní en Buenos Aires, que casualmente, 2 días antes del atentado, esa embajada se vacía, todos vuelven a Teherán. Lo mismo ocurrió con la embajada iraní de Uruguay. 2 días antes se vacía, no queda nadie y todos vuelven a Teherán. Y tenemos demostrado fehacientemente que en la embajada iraní en Buenos Aires es donde se planificó perfectamente el atentado del 94. Por eso nuestras denuncias permanentes del crecimiento de las embajadas iraníes en todos los países de Latinoamérica, ya teniendo la experiencia de haber sido uno de los países elegidos, los 2 países del continente elegidos para ataques terroristas como Estados Unidos y la Argentina. Y el comportamiento de Irán en Latinoamérica ya no solo la penetración y el reclutamiento lo hacen de diversas maneras. Tienen convenios universidades de Teherán con universidades en Buenos Aires, donde buscan el target de los jóvenes universitarios, donde poder trabajar una filosofía que rápidamente enciende en las sociedades latinoamericanas. Y es el poder mostrar que los problemas de las sociedades no es propio, sino que es ajeno. Es el imperialismo, el capitalismo, el colonialismo. Y en ese lugar ponen como enemigo a Estados Unidos y a todos sus socios estratégicos, incluido Israel. Y en países donde existen estos quizá nacionalismos extremos y esos populismos antisemitas, también es muy fácil que esto encienda rápidamente. Y el reclutamiento se utiliza distintos, quizá dirigentes sociales que comulgan con las ideas de Ahmadinejad. Son los que transitan por todos los lugares sociales donde saben que es muy fácil que prendan estas ideologías fundamentalistas y reclutan incluso hasta en zonas, en familias que tienen algún miembro convicto en la cárcel, ya proponiéndoles casi una salida laboral cuando salgan de su prisión. Y Irán se maneja. La justicia argentina ya tiene demostrado que financia el terrorismo internacional. La justicia argentina tiene demostrado fehacientemente la responsabilidad en distinto grado de quienes fueron en su momento, en el año 94, miembros del gobierno iraní. La justicia lo ha presentado frente a la Policía Internacional, que es Interpol, en Lyon, en Francia, donde el ejecutivo de Interpol, formado por 12 países, han decidido por unanimidad recomendar a la Asamblea General de Interpol elevar las circulares rojas, que es la captura internacional de estos sospechosos iraníes señalados por la justicia argentina. Pero lejos de poder dar cumplimiento a la justicia, la conducta iraní es permanentemente provocadora. Una vez conocidas las capturas internacionales de aquellos ex miembros del gobierno iraní, lo primero que hace Ahmadinejad es prácticamente premiar a uno de ellos, quien fuera el jefe de la misión revolucionaria iraní en aquel entonces, que eran las fuerzas más poderosas de Irán, que era Vahidi, lo nombra actualmente su ministro de Defensa. Una manera de premiar por sus buenas acciones. Y permanentemente ocurren las provocaciones por parte de Ahmadinejad. Y lo digo por lo menos en nombre de Argentina, que la justicia argentina está esperando que Irán de alguna manera colabore con ellas para esclarecer aquel terrorífico atentado del año 94, el segundo atentado en Buenos Aires. Y lejos de ello aparecen las provocaciones, cables que Irán manda al secretario general de las Naciones Unidas, en respuesta tal vez a discursos de la presidenta argentina en años anteriores, diciendo que la justicia argentina no es seria, que prácticamente es payasesco, que están investigando de una manera equivocada, que los argentinos financiamos el terrorismo internacional, una manera burlona de decir nunca vamos a colaborar con la justicia argentina. Y tuvimos un último acto provocador del gobierno de Irán cuando hace algunos 2 meses atrás, en Bolivia se inaugura un instituto militar bolivariano del ALBA, el cual Bolivia invita a ministros de defensas de muchísimos países a su inauguración oficial. Y quien concurre oficialmente es precisamente el ministro de Defensa iraní Beachhead, quien tiene captura internacional. E Irán se propone enviarlo casi a las puertas de la casa, en las fronteras con Argentina, país que lo señala judicialmente y espera que declaren frente a la justicia argentina en nuestro país, en cualquier otro país, como lo propuso la presidenta el año pasado en Naciones Unidas. En esa ocasión hubo una muy fuerte protesta nuestra, un pedido al gobierno argentino para que se expida frente a esta provocación, y nuestro pedido también al gobierno boliviano, en el cual yo en persona me he reunido con el ministro de Relaciones Exteriores de Bolivia en ocasión de la Asamblea General de la Organización de Estados Americanos que se realizó en El Salvador, pidiéndole las explicaciones porque Beachhead estuvo en Bolivia, formó parte oficial de la inauguración del Instituto Militar, estuvo descansando después de ese acontecimiento. Nosotros lo hemos denunciado, que estaba descansando en el Hotel Casablanca en Santa Cruz, en Bolivia, que se lo podía detener, que se podía tomar alguna acción. Sin embargo, Beachhead, después de descansar tranquilamente y después de cumplir su misión, tomó su avión y volvió a Teherán. No hubo muchas explicaciones del canciller boliviano, pero sí le hemos pedido una reunión a Evo Morales, al presidente de Bolivia, porque entendemos que debe de haber en Latinoamérica por lo menos alguna solidaridad con los países hermanos, con los pueblos hermanos, independientemente de sus gobiernos, con el cual uno a veces piensa que somos socios estratégicos por formar parte de distintos grupos, la UNASUR, Mercosur, distintos grupos de países en la región en la que debemos de tener un comportamiento no solo en lo comercial, sino en lo que se refiere a amenazas. Y hoy Latinoamérica se ha convertido en un lugar de, digamos, peligroso por lo que significa la amenaza del terrorismo internacional. Y le hemos planteado al presidente Evo Morales que entendíamos de que debería haber habido alguna actitud solidaria con un país como la Argentina, que ha sufrido 2 atentados terroristas, y el hecho de no haberlo sufrido no lo hace inmune a ser un objetivo de un golpe terrorista. Pero le dije algo más, que el atentado terrorista del año 94 en Buenos Aires no fue solo la comunidad judía, ni tampoco fue a ciudadanos argentinos solamente. 6 de ellos eran bolivianos. Y pensamos que el gobierno boliviano por lo menos debería tener alguna actitud frente a las víctimas en esa ocasión. Por eso planteamos que el terrorismo es un fenómeno criminal, porque atenta básicamente contra el derecho fundamental del hombre, que es la vida. Y lo venimos planteando en todos los ámbitos que podemos, porque nosotros fuimos objetivos de ese actuar terrorista, como puede serlo cualquiera en cualquier lugar del mundo. Pero lo que se necesita entender es la insaciabilidad Cuando uno dice nos convertimos en objetivo del terrorismo, tenemos que entender que el terrorismo nunca alcanza el objetivo. Es insaciable. El terrorismo busca permanentemente sembrar con el terror constante la mayor cantidad de muertes para seguir imponiendo sus ideas y mostrar dónde está el enemigo. Y en este acto provocador es donde nos encontramos nosotros en Argentina en una situación de aflicción, y no hablo solo de la comunidad judía, sino de la sociedad argentina, donde nos merecemos, como todas las sociedades civilizadas, la respuesta de la justicia. No solo ya por las víctimas, no solo un deber hacia los familiares de las víctimas, no solo tampoco a la comunidad judía, sino a la sociedad toda. La impunidad frente a los actos de terrorismo genera mucho más inseguridad. La lógica terrorista hace pensar que si se cometen 2 atentados terroristas en un mismo lugar y no hay ningún avance en la justicia, es muy fácil poder seguir pensando cómo cometer otro ataque terrorista. Y en los últimos tiempos quizás tenemos algunas actitudes que nos preocupan más. Irán envió una nota, un mensaje al gobierno argentino, pocos días antes de un nuevo aniversario del ataque a la Mutual del año 94, precisamente el 16 de julio, en el que manifiesta intenciones de comenzar un diálogo constructivo con el gobierno argentino. Y nosotros cuando hablo de nosotros, hablo de la comunidad judía, nos hemos expresado enérgicamente en que para nosotros es muy difícil, es casi imposible comenzar un diálogo o hablar de negociaciones cuando en el medio hay un incumplimiento judicial y una negativa permanente a colaborar con la justicia argentina, a pesar de tantos mensajes o notas que Irán ha enviado precisamente a Naciones Unidas, mostrando la intención de colaborar con la justicia. Pero en la última nota a la que recién hacía referencia, y en la que Irán propone un diálogo constructivo con el gobierno, esa mención está solo en el último párrafo. Pero comenzando a leer el cable desde el principio, comienza diciendo que no hay iraníes sospechosos, todos los iraníes son inocentes. Segundo punto, que bajo las leyes de la República Islámica de Irán, el gobierno de Irán tiene el deber y el derecho de proteger a todos los ciudadanos iraníes. Y el tercer punto, a decir nuevamente que la justicia argentina no es seria, que está totalmente equivocada, que está investigando por el camino correcto. Y en virtud de todo esto, Irán propone comenzar un diálogo constructivo. Casi es una manera de decir, comencemos una página nueva. Mientras nosotros esperamos todavía que los gobiernos del mundo puedan instar a Irán a que colabore con la justicia argentina, a pesar de sus negativas. Y desgraciadamente en esta última Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas, si bien la presidenta argentina volvió a reclamar que los sospechosos iraníes se presenten frente a la justicia argentina en nuestro país o en un tercer país, ocurrió un hecho que en toda la Argentina se ha criticado, y es que Argentina se quedó en el recinto presenciando el discurso de Ahmadinejad cuando otros 29 países se levantaron y se retiraron. Argentina no se quedaba a presenciar el discurso de Ahmadinejad desde hacía muchísimos años, y este año entendió que aquel cable al que yo hacía mención se refería a una nueva actitud de Irán y que por eso había que tener un gesto con ese país para que colabore con la justicia. Por supuesto que nos es difícil aceptarlo, entendiendo las manifestaciones de Irán en todas las oportunidades que ha mandado un cable, y mucho más aún este último cable, donde lo que está pretendiendo es terminar con esta vieja historia de la investigación y comenzar un capítulo nuevo. El gobierno argentino manifestó que le dio instrucciones al embajador argentino en Naciones Unidas para que se quede presenciando, porque debemos tener buenos gestos con Irán a partir de este momento. Preocupa doblemente, una porque Irán todavía no tuvo ninguna actitud, por lo menos ninguna actitud que haya cambiado. Y en segunda instancia es un negador abierto del Holocausto. Y los negadores, quizá cuando en una historia los primeros negadores eran para defenderse de sus acciones, y después era para hablar sobre la conspiración del pueblo judío para tener un Estado. Los negadores contemporáneos solo lo que buscan es que se vuelva a cometer un nuevo holocausto. ¿Y por qué digo nuestra llamada de atención? La Argentina es uno de los 27 países que conforman la International Task Force, que es el Grupo Internacional de Cooperación para el Estudio, Investigación y Recordación del Holocausto. Es increíble que un miembro que conforma la International Task Force se quede en el recinto escuchando a un negador del Holocausto como es Ahmadinejad. Y quienes lo siguen, porque tiene muchos seguidores Ahmadinejad como negador del Holocausto. Quienes lo que lo siguen no hacen otra cosa que traicionar los ideales que dicen defender. Tenemos seguidores no solo gobierno, tenemos en nuestro país y en tantos otros, en América Latina, intelectuales de la sociedad que creen ver progresismo donde solo hay teocracia, donde solo hay terror y horror. Pero están convencidos, ven progresismo. Pero sí, nosotros somos capaces de reconocer a los lobos aunque se vistan de cordero. Esa es nuestra misión, nuestra organización, como comentaba antes Jaime, es la institución que representa a todas las instituciones judías de la Argentina, que son 150, y que lucha contra el antisemitismo, la discriminación, la intolerancia, la xenofobia, y que también atiende la seguridad de la comunidad y tiene que atender tristemente y a diario las amenazas del terrorismo internacional. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaime, and thank you to the Hudson Institute for the opportunity to be here. I've been told on numerous occasions I tend to speak very quickly, so if I get going too fast, Jaime, pull on my shirt or something and I'll slow down a little bit. I tend to really go fast, they say. I want to talk a little bit about the role of Iran and the Bolivarian structure in Latin America in a little bit different terms, a little bit different framework than was just presented. I think if you look at where Iran is in the region today, you see, obviously, as noted earlier, they've made significant advances. They've opened a number of embassies. They've established themselves as an economic force. They've established themselves as an intelligence broker in numerous countries, and they're playing a significant role, much different than they have in any time in Latin American history. But they're also facing significant difficulties. As Hugo Chavez's illness demonstrates, they have the strong chance of losing their strongest advocate in the region. Venezuela's economic decline is also limits what they can do to support Iran and what they can actually do in real terms as far as economic development, joint economic development. You have Evo Morales in Bolivia undergoing the most severe crisis of his presidency, and with his approval ratings plummeting as he's handled several crises in a unusually inept manner, given that he came to power because of attacks against his people and marches before he assumed the presidency, causing the previous president, González Sánchez de Lozada, to resign. His own troops then attacking marchers of his own supporters in a general sense, and killing at least one child and several others has caused a great deal of turmoil there. And you have Evo Morales facing significantly declining popularity Rafael Correa significantly declining in Ecuador. This changes the regional dynamic, I think, for Iran. They're no longer able to just sail in with strong allies and reach a host of alliances and agreements that as they have in the past. And I think this is what makes the attitude in Argentina particularly disturbing as they change toward a much more, they've already been strongly in Hugo Chavez's camp. And as Hugo Chavez declines and Venezuela declines, I think they're going to be looking significantly for new actors, new relevance in the region. In Argentina, with its strong economy and its traditional alliance with Chavez, if not with Iran, offers a significant opening. And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind as you watch how the Argentine-Iran relationship develops. I think that you'll see you'll see Iran pushing into numerous other spheres. They're already very active in Brazil. I think the Brazilian relationship is significantly different from the other relationships in Latin America, primarily because in Brazil, when a vice minister of Iran comes, they meet with their counterpart, another vice minister. If a minister comes, they meet with the minister. In all the other countries, the Bolivarian Revolution, it's Ahmadinejad with whoever the president is. It's Ahmadinejad and Chavez, it's Ahmadinejad and Evo Morales, and there's no transparency at all, whereas Brazil, although it has the largest relationship economically with Iran, is fairly transparent, and I would say a significantly different type of relationship than you see with the Bolivarian states. I think one needs to ask and look back on what it is Iran is looking for in this relationship and what it's trying to extract while it can, and it may be able to continue, it may not, depending on, to a great deal, on how the Bolivarian Revolution fares in different countries. I think if you look at what Iran has done, you see that they have several basic interests at stake. What are they trying to do fundamentally in Latin America? Primarily, they're trying to break their economic isolation. One of the things that the United States and the European Union and finally the United Nations have done fairly well is impose a series of sanctions on Iran's commercial activities, particularly its banking activities. So what do you see Iran do when they come into every country? They initially began obviously with Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez introduced them then around into Ecuador, into Bolivia. If you look at Ortega in Nicaragua, he has a much longer standing relationship with Iran than any of the other Bolivarian leaders, and certainly didn't need the introduction. He knew the Iranians back in 1979, and if you'll recall, he famously said when the Sandinista revolution triumphed in Managua, the Sandinista revolution and the Iranian revolution are twins. We stand for the same principles and will always be together. And so I think in looking at the Iranian alliances, we often also sort of put to the side the Nicaragua piece of it, but it's actually much deeper than the Venezuelan piece in many ways. But you see Iran trying to set up financial institutions. We've had numerous examples of their sanctioned banks that have set up operations in Venezuela. We now see a large push into Panama where they're setting up numerous front companies where they're able to buy a lot of material that is sanctioned in the international realm, but they can buy them through Venezuelan companies and through other Bolivarian countries as they're able to evade the sanctions. But primarily they need a way to move their money. They need to be able to move their money outside into the Western financial system to buy what they want to buy. And so you see this enormous press into these multi or binational development associations, as they call them, the fondos binacionales, where they will invest, they say, $1 or $2 billion each country, et cetera, each country and their counterpart to set up these binational things. And if you look at what happens to those binational funds, they don't ever do anything. There's no record of any commercial activity after that. It's simply a laundering mechanism, but it allows Iran to put its money into the system, wash it out through the Bolivarian states, and go on their way. But what else does Iran do in every single country? And I think this is one of the things that we don't focus on. We focus a lot on what Iran says. And what Iran says is very interesting and it's important, but they say the same thing all the time and they do very little of it. What I think is much more important to focus on is what they actually do, which is just a small sliver of what they say they're going to do, but it's consistent across the Bolivarian states and what they actually choose to complete. If you look at the memorandums of understandings that they sign across the region in the Bolivarian structure, they always ask for banking privileges. The Economic Development Bank of Iran, one of the sanctioned banks by both the United Nations, the U.S., and also the EU, figures prominently in setting up banks inside of banks. If you look at the Ecuadorian example, the Economic Development Bank of Iran deposited 100, or was going to deposit, they say they never did, but if you look at the bank transactions out of the Ecuadorian Central Bank, a lot of money went out right as this was being said. They were supposed to deposit $120 million in the Ecuadorian Central Bank. The purpose of this deposit, said the Ecuadorian government when this became public, was that they needed to foment the booming economic ties with Iran because they were so robust, they just had to have more support. But if you look at the actual import-export bilateral trade between Ecuador and Iran, it never was more than $600,000 a year. Hardly necessary for a $120 million investment. And if you look at the transactions through their bank in, wholly controlled bank in Miami that the Ecuadorian Central Bank controls, there were several multi-million-dollar transfers out right as they were denying they ever actually accepted this money. So one has to wonder what was going on there. They always ask for shipping companies. They signed a memorandum of understanding to build sorry, okay. You got me, sorry. Yes, okay, I apologize. They always sign memorandums of understanding relating to the establishment of shipping companies, which is one of the things that the United States has done exceptionally well in its sanctions with Iran, is monitor how they reconfigure their shipping fleets. They re-register them in different countries. They rename the ships that are in the shipping companies that are sanctioned and keep going. But in every country, and what really is striking is Ecuador particularly. They signed a memorandum of understanding with Ecuador to create a dedicated shipping line between Ecuador and Iran. When you're doing $600,000 worth of bilateral commerce and you have to cross the Panama Canal to get to Iran, it's not really a very viable investment. It's not something that makes economic sense. So I think one of the things that we don't do very well in our policy community is look at not what is said, but what doesn't make sense. What are the multiple anomalies that you see in the declared relationship between Iran and these different countries? And I'd like to touch on what I think is actually the heart of the matter, because I think one of the things that we look at and one of the things that we say, and I hear it all the time in policy discussions, is, well, Iran and Venezuela, Iran and Bolivia, what do they have in common? Nothing. This whole thing is just a way to stick the United States in the eye and make us unhappy, but there's basically no there there. There's no threat to their behavior because basically nothing ties them together. So we don't really have to worry about it. And I began to sort of think about this, and for a while it made sense to me. And it's true, there's no cultural ties, no religious ties, no language ties, very few commercial ties of any significance that bind these together. But I began reading what Hugo Chavez particularly talks about, and it became clear over his evolution, and then looking back at what he was reading and what the people that he was reading were writing, it became clear that you have this certain point, this ability to merge in the mind of the Bolivarian revolutionary states, the idea that Marxist-Leninism can coexist with radical Shia Islam. And it's a bit of a jump, and still you start reading their literature. It makes no sense except if you read what they actually say. The seminal event to both the Bolivarian Revolution and the Iranian theocracy is the 1979 Iranian Revolution. If you read what they write, going back to the 1980s, 1990s when this began to come out, and the real intellectual architect of this is really fascinating, is Sanchez Ramirez, Carlos the Jackal, the famous Venezuelan terrorist. He's in prison now, serving a life sentence for assassinating some French policemen. He'll never get out, although Chavez has worked very hard to bring him out. But in 2003, he writes a really interesting book called Revolutionary Islam. And in this book, he synthesizes various other thinkers from across both the Marxist world, of which he was an integral part, and the Islamist world, of which he'd become an integral part after he converted. And his basic thesis is that we share a great deal because we have a common enemy, and the common enemy is the United States. And within that context, he writes after in 2003, which is after 9/11, obviously, that there's a part of his book which is basically an ode to bin Laden and the attacks on the Twin Towers, saying what a magnificent strike it was, how the West will be choking on terrorism as it rots from inside, etc., going forward. It was not a huge bestseller, but a few people read it, and it synthesized this basic fundamental understanding that the Iranians view the 1979 revolution as an act of God. Allah reached down and smote the United States in its arrogance for its multiple sins. And the Bolivarians look at it as a way to wage asymmetrical warfare against the United States successfully. And so you see this rash of literature on asymmetrical warfare. And the next person who picks up the ball and really runs with it, takes Carlos the Jackal's thoughts and then pushes it forward, is Jorge Versinge in this little book, La Guerra Periférica y el Islam Revolucionario, Asymmetrical Warfare and Revolutionary Islam. Versinge is neither a Muslim nor a military person, but he states, as Carlos the Jackal stated before him, one fundamental understanding of what this asymmetrical warfare means. And that is, and this is to me the heart of the danger we're seeing, weapons of mass destruction are a legitimate weapon to use against the West and to destroy the empire. That's one of the fundamental theses of this book and of the previous books. Now, this book did not get a lot of traction outside of a few anti-globalist groups in Spain and around Europe, etc., except that Hugo Chavez found it. And Hugo Chavez really liked this book. He thought it answered a great many questions. So he invited Versinge to his asymmetrical warfare conference in 2005 and adopted this book eventually as official Venezuelan military doctrine, and has had pocket-sized editions printed up for all his officers to carry in their pockets and read it and study it. It's sort of similar to Gaddafi's Green Book, but what's particularly troublesome, it's not a particularly coherent book. It's not a difficult read. There's not a lot of mega thoughts out there that make you stand back, except the fundamental idea that everyone is entitled to any weapon necessary to destroy us because of the horrors we have wrought on humanity through the years. And I think once I began to read and get into their literature, a lot of their behavior then begins to make more sense. And this alliance, which we generally, as I say, is generally dismissed in policymaking circles as something between an irritant and a minor problem, is actually fundamentally more serious. And I say this because as you look across where the Bolivarian Revolution has touched in Latin America, all the countries have one thing in common, and that is the incredible criminalization of the states in which the Bolivarian Revolution operates. They have become criminalized mostly through the drug trade, and their alliances with non-state actors. And I think one of the really interesting things to look at is if you look at Iran and Hezbollah, you see a certain structure there that operates, command and control structure, the ability to use proxies, which Chavez has sought to imitate very closely with the FARC. And if you look at the FARC structure, I think we underestimate the FARC to our own detriment. Today, yes, militarily it's quite weakened without question, but they've managed through the last 5 or 6 years to establish a very significant international network of political front groups, particularly the Movimiento Continental Bolivariano, the Continental Bolivarian Movement, which essentially brings together what used to be the most radicalized and armed elements of the Foro de Sao Paulo into a new grouping in which the commander of the FARC is always present in every meeting they have. The last one was in Venezuela. The one prior to that was in Ecuador just before the Colombians bombed the Raúl Reyes camp. And if you look at what was happening in 2008, the bombing of Raúl Reyes' camp was on March 1st, 2008. One of the reasons the Colombians pulled the trigger at that particular time to bomb Raúl Reyes' camp in Ecuador, understanding that it would provoke a significant international incident, was that they were watching this parade of transnational criminal organizations go down and visit Raúl Reyes in his camp. They had identified the camp previously. They knew the general area in which it was. But when they saw Mexicans, groups, the ETA, Basque terrorist groups, the MRTA from Peru showing up, what I thought, having grown up in Latin America and covered the region for many, many years, I thought most of these groups had disappeared. The MIR of Chile, the Mapuches, all of these groups were showing up. All of them were still active, all of them receiving funding from the FARC, or through the FARC at least, and they were all heading down to meet Raúl Reyes and meet with him. And the Colombians had already undergone the experience of watching what the Irish Republican Army training had done with the FARC and what the ETA training had done with them as far as intelligence gathering, explosives, and counterintelligence, all of those things that had greatly strengthened the FARC. and they were determined that this was not going to happen again. And that's one of the triggers for their attack on March 1st on the Raul Reyes camp. But I think if you look at across the region, you now see almost every major shipment. I don't know if it's every major shipment still. As of 6 months ago it was, but it may have changed a little bit. Every major cocaine shipment caught in West Africa, busted in West Africa, originated in Venezuela. Hard to imagine that that could happen without some very senior support from the Venezuelan government. And if you look at the OFAC designations, a lot of people think that the OFAC, which is the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control, they designate people as drug traffickers or terrorists. A lot of people think that that's sort of a exercise in futility. Most of these people don't have money in the States anyway. We can't freeze their assets. And I say the contrary. I say the naming and shaming campaign, when you can present public evidence of this involvement of senior Venezuelan officials directly in drug trafficking and directly support for the FARC, and as they've done in 2008, directly supporting Hezbollah, you've achieved something notable. And it's good for societies to know in general and to have a public record of what we know of what their activities are. And this brings me to the final thing. Within the criminalized states, you have the ability to form multiple alliances that are no longer based on ideology, no longer based on anything other than expedience. And I think this is one of the things that left over from the Cold War that we haven't absorbed very well. We still think that certain types of people won't deal with certain other types of people because, well, they don't like each other. Ideologically, they're opposed to each other. And that's largely, in this day and age, nonsense. And if you read, the DIA did this public service last year in congressional testimony outlining some of the operations of the Quds Force, the special forces of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and how they are completely non-ideological and pragmatic in the alliances they seek. And I think that this is what brings us to, with the weapons of mass destruction element, the other major threat we're facing from the region at this time through the Bolivarian states, and that is that we now have the ability of the FARC, Hezbollah, Quds Force to work together in ways that 10 years ago, 5 years ago would have been unthinkable. They now have the ability. One of the things that I found fascinating, I was working with the Colombian military looking at ideological issues, and I showed them this book, and they had not seen it, and they had read it last year, and they were like, oh, this is really interesting, cool, they read it. And when I went back again a few months later, they were like, holy cow, you wouldn't believe what we saw. And I said, what are you seeing? They said, for the first time, we're seeing this book in FARC camps. When they bust up FARC camps, this is now being studied by the FARC, which is part of the ideological or the migration of this type of thinking across the region. And one of the things they said was that the old guard of the FARC, Manuel Marulanda and the old guard, wouldn't tolerate this mixture with radical Islam. They were Marxists of the old style. They didn't like this mixing of stuff. They wanted to be Marxist. The new guard, the new generation, partly because they're hammered militarily and they're looking for more outlets, but also because they're more flexible in their ideology, are embracing this idea of asymmetrical warfare and radical Islam as partners. I wouldn't say that anyone's converting, but the idea of this partnership seems to be much more appealing to them. And finally, if you look at one of the things I spend a lot of time on, which is geographic control. Who controls the geographic pipelines that come across from Iran through northern South America, from Bolivia, Central America, Mexico, and into the United States multiple hundreds of times every day? It's the drug trafficking gangs of Mexico, the street gangs, the MS-13 and others in Central America, allied with and largely being fed by cocaine produced by the FARC. And if you look at one of the primary routes now that moves cocaine to the United States, it's very interesting because it goes from the FARC in Ecuador, because they're now do most of their fabricating in Ecuador, to the Mexican DTOs. They turn it over. The FARC still does not have an international drug trafficking operation. They dump it with the Mexicans. The Mexicans then move it through what used to be the Marxist network in Central America, Daniel Ortega's group in Nicaragua, to the Communist Party groups in El Salvador, through Guatemala, into Mexico. The exact same parallel structure functions with groups that used to be on the far right. It's not an ideological thing. If you look at how the drugs move now, they're basically groups that for years were at war with each other, who are now able to do business together and bring an incredible level of sophistication to old routes that were traditionally used for minor weapons trafficking, procurement of different types of travel documents, money transfers, all of those things are being used in the same routes, in the same banks, and many of the same people, but on an exponentially expanded basis because the drug money brings in a whole new level of concern. So I think if you look across the region at what Iran is doing, this is one of the reasons, as my predecessor said, you see this ability of the region to absorb the Iranians in ways that a few years ago I think we would have thought were incomprehensible. What the hell are the Iranians doing there? They stand out. No, they don't talk the language, all of these things. But the region is an incredible process, or parts of the region, of turmoil, political turmoil, and with a great, I would say, influx of transnational organized criminal organizations that make it much easier for these groups to operate, and also with the criminalization of states that need to survive. If you look at the fundamental guiding force of the Bolivarian Revolution, it's not so much ideology, although if you parse their ideology, it is more fascist than socialist, or they like to call themselves socialists. It's basically survival. That's what these guys, Chavez wants to hang on as long as he can. Ortega, the same thing. If it were convenient for Ortega to call himself a social democrat, he would be a social democrat. He wouldn't be a Sandinista. So it has very little to do with the traditional ways of looking at ideology that we would look at, and it has a great deal to do with power and money. And into this mix, I think bringing an embrace of weapons of mass destruction against this giant to the north has always wronged us, is more appealing than we give it credit for, and it has more ideological coherence, more roots in thinking that are more rational than we often expect or we often look at. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Ambassador?
Well, thank you very much, Jaime, for inviting me. The problem with following Doug Farah is actually it's a happy problem, because my presentation is going to be a lot shorter than it would have been, because many of the things that he mentioned I was going to mention in here, but that's good. As some of you know, one of my historical heroes is Winston Churchill, and Churchill said, when you're going to give a speech, be brief or be brilliant. So I'll be brief. I hope you got that. My topic for this particular seminar on Iran and Latin America is to look at, or at least my instructions from Jaime are to look at this issue from the standpoint of U.S., the United States, U.S. security, and then to try to answer this question of what to expect from Iran in Latin America after Chavez. There's no way to cover the very broad series of themes that come under that topic. As we've just seen, I mean, Doug Farah has summarized a lot of what he has written about in a number of books. So I'll try to concentrate on a few things. And one of the things I was going to finish with, I want to emphasize, because one of the things that he just mentioned at the end, that what we're dealing with in this alliance of countries that are self-declared, in many cases self-declared enemies of the United States, is an organized crime enterprise, much more than a government, an ideology, a revolution, whatever they call themselves. And I'll get to that. Now, what are the odds, just quickly, what are the odds that there will be a Venezuela without Chavez anytime soon? We all know how sick he is. He apparently suffers from cancer. I say apparently because, as in the case of Cuba, one never knows. It's a state secret what the head of state, or the capo, whichever you want to call him, happens to be ailing from. In addition, there's an election scheduled for October of 2012 in Venezuela, 1 year from now. There are three possibilities, therefore. One, that Chavez dies before the election. Two, he survives the cancer but loses the election. And three, he survives the cancer and wins the election. A Chavez in power in Venezuela beyond 2012 is dangerous to this hemisphere and to U.S. security. We've heard today many of the reasons why the presence of the government of Iran in this hemisphere is harmful to freedom and democracy. We heard with lujo de detalles, as they say in Latin America, with an enormous amount of detail about Argentina, and there are other examples. Just as the government of Iran has been destructive to freedom and democracy in Iran, and in countries where it has had influence, such as Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. In addition to Iran's brutal dictatorship, there are many reasons why the United States opposes Iran, such as Tehran's effort to build a nuclear bomb, and the stated policy of Iran's president and Grand Ayatollah, respectively, to, quote, wipe Israel off the map of the world. Besides Israel, does anyone doubt that if Ahmadinejad or Khamenei had the power to also wipe the U.S., the great Satan, off the map of the world, they would not try to do so? I think they would. So I begin my remarks with a number of conclusions that I hope will well-informed audiences will recognize as self-evident. First, that Iran's government is evil, destructive, expansionistic, and poses a threat to the United States and its allies. Second, that Iran is not alone, that it has state and non-state allies, allies that also commit evil and destructive acts, as Hezbollah and Syria are committing even as we speak, and that would like to destroy the United States. Third, that in this hemisphere, Iran's allies are the nations of a group that calls itself ALBA, the Spanish acronym for Bolivarian Alliance of the People of the Americas. The ideologically motivated members of the group, the dangerous ones, are Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. There are three or four, before somebody corrects me, there are 3 or 4 small Caribbean islands that are members of ALBA. I tend not to highlight them because, frankly, they had to join in exchange for 100% of their oil consumption being provided by Chavez. I don't think they're ideological members of ALBA, and if they were getting the oil from us, they would not be members of ALBA, in my opinion. Fourth, that ALBA's real objective is the destruction of the system of self-government that has been known for centuries as Western democracy, and its replacement with something called 21st century socialism, which to me is the repackaging in new bottles of the old wine of the last century's 2 branches of socialism, the international socialism of the Soviets and the national socialism of Germany. And fifth, that the United States must lead an effort to win the asymmetric war that those 21st century despots and their allies are waging against us, but that the United States is not leading. The United States is unequaled in its ability to fight conventional or nuclear wars. No other nation even comes close to our military prowess. That is as it should be, but it can be dangerous. It can be deceptive. Because the war of today, as in Afghanistan, is the asymmetric war, the war between opponents of uneven strength, where the weaker power uses guerrilla war, terrorizing the population, narcotics traffic, organized crime, sabotage, propaganda, psychological warfare, and other weapons. It is my view that for many of these weapons, the United States has either not prepared or has not developed adequate responses. It is logical, then, that a seminar on Iran and the Americas must address Hugo Chavez and ALBA, because they are both proponents of asymmetric warfare. And so are Iran's and Venezuela's allies, advocates of asymmetric war, as we will see. Iran's and Venezuela's allies used those methods I listed above, and some of them were also mentioned and illustrated by Doug Farah. Some use some methods more than others. Though Iran was brought as an active player into the hemisphere by Chavez, it was actually Chavez's mentor, Fidel Castro, who first saw Iran as a potential ally in the war against the United States. In May of 2001, just 4 months before 9/11, Agence France-Presse reported that Fidel Castro, while visiting Tehran, proudly proclaimed, and I quote, "Iran and Cuba, in cooperation with each other, can bring America to its knees." I don't think he was talking about praying. As I said earlier, that Iran's allies in this hemisphere are the nations of ALBA, a movement is associated primarily with Hugo Chavez. It was actually originally created by Fidel Castro in Havana, Cuba, in 1966 as the Tricontinental, uniting so-called movements of national liberation from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Tricontinental survives to this day as OSPAL, with headquarters in Havana, and proclaims its support for the Arab peoples, but only for those who espouse anti-American revolution. The effort of the anti-American revolutionaries like Castro and now Chavez and others to attack the United States through any means necessary is more than 50 years old, at least in the case of Castro. What Chavez has done with Venezuelan oil money is to totally revive and modernize the Tricontinental's moribund agenda, energize it, and fund it with such large quantities of money that experts in Venezuela differ by as much as tens of billions of dollars in their estimates of how much Chavez has given his allies around the world. Chavez himself has announced that he has spent over $60 billion in 12 years in support of his foreign policy initiatives. Cuba alone receives the equivalent of $4 billion a year in oil from Venezuela, for which it does not pay. By the way, that's just shy of the amount that the Soviet Union provided to Cuba when Cuba was a client of the Soviet Union, just to give you an idea of the importance of Chavez's money. This has an impact on the question I was asked to address. What happens after Chavez? If the Castro dynasty is still running Cuba, they will find a replacement for Chavez because they cannot survive without Venezuela's subsidies. Castro will work with the other nations that are financially dependent on Venezuela to ensure that Chavez, should he die before the election, is replaced by a similar Chavista, or, if Chavez wins, that he is surrounded by the same coterie of sycophants and incompetents that allow the Castro brothers to make the important decisions for Chavez. As I said earlier, the dangerous members of ALBA are Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. They all have close ties to Iran. I won't get into that because Doug mentioned it. I should also mention some of Venezuela's extracontinental allies, however. This list further illustrates the nature of the regime and the Chavez regime and proves the old adage that birds of a feather flock together. Chavez's best friends include Russia, which has sold Chavez billions of dollars of advanced military equipment, Belarus, whose President Lukashenko is referred to as the last communist dictator in Europe, China, which is making multi-billion-dollar investments in infrastructure, particularly energy in Venezuela, Zimbabwe, still led by that great 20th century socialist Robert Mugabe, the aforementioned Syria, run for decades by Bashar al-Assad, referred to by Chavez as, quote, a humanist, doctor, educated in London, in no way an extremist. He is a man of great human sensitivity. This is the same Bashar al-Assad who is running over people with his tanks in Syria today. I'm not making that up. That was a direct quotation, by the way, by Chavez. And until recently, another one of Chavez's great friends was Muammar Gaddafi, presently in an undisclosed secure location, who awarded Chavez and other members of ALBA, like Rafael Correa, the president of Ecuador, who I'll mention in a minute, the much coveted Gaddafi Peace Prize. The ALBA pattern for taking over a country is simple. Ecuador and Bolivia have followed it. First, you win an election freely, but with enormous financial resources, mostly from Venezuela. But in the case of Ecuador, for example, from terrorist groups allied with Chavez. According to evidence found in tapes captured by Colombian military forces in a FARC training camp inside Ecuador, and verified by Interpol and organizations like the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London. Quote, FARC contributed approximately $400,000 to Correa's campaign. 100,000 came directly from FARC itself and a further 300,000 from its allies. At a critical juncture, Correa almost certainly approved the use of these funds, unquote, according to IISS in London. Once in power, Bolivia, by the way, it isn't just Ecuador, Bolivia. We have the case of Argentina, which a lot of people here know, where it was obvious that Chavez was sending money to the campaign of the current president, who will probably be reelected this month, Mrs. Kirchner. It is estimated it was at least $5 million, of which 800,000 were picked up by accident by a customs agent who happened to look in the wrong bag or the right bag, depending on how you see it. Once in power, the Bolivarians changed the rules of the game, packed the judiciary with the president's allies, hold a referendum early on to allow re-election, to get rid of undesirable legislators and pack the legislature with supporters, even if they have to be bought, and further concentrate powers in the hands of the executive. They politicized the police and the military, replacing professional officers with followers or simply buying allegiances through bribes. They weaken and intimidate the press, the business community, and all institutions of civil society. Pretty soon, no one dares challenge the once democratically elected president. Ecuador's Rafael Correa, for example, feels so secure in his hold on power after following this pattern that he recently stated, and there's a tape available for anyone who wants to see it, quote, that says, Correa says, I am not only the head of government, I am the head of the judiciary and the head of the legislature, unquote. When an Ecuadorian newspaper, a respected newspaper, dared to print a well-documented story detailing Correa's ties to corruption, Correa took the case to his hand-picked court, one of his hand-picked courts, for defamation, which of course, not surprisingly, awarded him $40 million, awarded the president of the country $40 million to him, not to the office of the president, but to him. This is one of the things I mean by changing the rules of the game and destroying representative democracy. Another example is Evo Morales, president of what he now calls the Plurinational Republic of Bolivia. Morales is not only president of Bolivia, but he's simultaneously the president of the 6 top coca leaf growers unions. He was a coca grower union president in his earlier life, and he is one of Chavez's earliest allies. I was going to tell you about some of the story about how he came to power, but Doug did that for me, so I'll be briefer. Meanwhile, under Morales, coca and cocaine production, processing, and money laundering have risen dramatically in Bolivia. Morales has expelled the U.S. DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the U.S. ambassador, and threatened to expel USAID unless it ceases democracy programs. Inexplicably, the Obama administration agreed to seize the democracy programs to keep USAID from being expelled. Speaking of inexplicable actions, that term can describe the entire Obama administration policy toward Latin America for the last 3 years. What should our policy be? And with this, I'll conclude. First, we must recognize that there does exist an alliance of evildoers in this hemisphere. Whether we call it an axis of evil or something else is not important. What we do about it is important. We must recognize that the U.S. faces an unconventional threat in this hemisphere, that it uses all forms of legal and illegal methods to expand its territory, that this axis or cartel, this ALBA, intends to destroy democracy by redefining it and redesigning it after it acquires it democratically. Let us not forget that the two of the least democratic nations in the world recently were the late German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, and the still Leninist People's Democratic Republic of Korea. What, again, U.S. policy, what should we do once we make a decision that there is this enemy The State Department doesn't like that word. They don't like to use the word enemy. The State Department, which I've been proud to serve for many years, believes that we have adversaries. I believe we have enemies who would like to kill us. We have, unfortunately, many experiences of that in our history. I think we should develop countermeasures for this asymmetric warfare. We should develop political, psychological, economic, informational, and other non-lethal responses. For example, the Treasury Department recently began to designate some of Chavez's closest advisors as drug kingpins. These are his bagmen. If you want to destroy the mafia, you go after the money trail. It is an open secret that there are more names on the list of drug kingpins. But among the Treasury designated drug kingpins that have already been sanctioned by the Treasury Department are Chavez's former or current Minister of Interior, that's the head cop in Latin America, the head of military intelligence, the head of the equivalent of the FBI, and the head of the equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So imagine if Admiral Mike Mullen, who just retired last week as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, if Leon Panetta, when he was head of CIA, if Robert Mueller, the head of the FBI, and other ministers or secretaries of our cabinet had been designated as drug kingpins, I think it would probably be something that we'd be reading about. Very few Americans even know about this. What we can do also is seize our oil dependency on Venezuela. This is a controversial subject. A lot of my Venezuelan friends and some Americans don't like to hear it. They believe that if we begin to reduce our dependence on Venezuela today, that once Chavez is gone, assuming he's gone, that the United States will no longer need Venezuela when they want to go back and rebuild the country. And we all hope they go back and rebuild the country. The problem is that Chavez is taking measures to eliminate the United States as a market. He is increasing as I said earlier, the ties with China, increasing sales to China, and China has all the money in the world. And even though it takes 35 days to ship through the Panama Canal for a ship to reach China, and only 3 days to reach the U.S. Gulf Coast, Chavez doesn't care what it costs. His hatred of the United States is more than enough subsidy for selling oil to China or any of the other members of his group of supporters. We have already reduced the amount of oil that we import from Venezuela. And he's already reduced the amount of oil that he sends to us. But the difference is so enormous that if we were to decide to really reduce our dependence on Venezuela, first I think it would be healthy for the U.S. economy and for our security. But 80%, consider these figures, approximately 80% of Venezuelan exports of oil go to the United States, one market. 8% of our imports come from Venezuela. That's how unequal the relationship is. That's an asymmetric relationship. I think we should exploit it in our favor. Now, I'm going through some of the things that my colleague Doug mentioned that I don't need to repeat. Let me just finish by saying what I said at the beginning. I believe that we're dealing in this ALBA group, Cuba, Venezuela, particularly Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and to some degree Nicaragua. We're dealing with a racketeer influence criminal organization, a RICO, which is a term that the Justice Department has. And I think what we need to do is approach it as such. It is not, we should perhaps be worried about the military buildup and the large amounts of modern, very modern weapons that say the Russians have sold to Venezuela. But in some cases, I think that's a distraction. Because the real danger to the United States is not that they're going to send one of those Su-30s up against an American aircraft carrier. I don't think so. They are designed, those big weapons purchases are designed to intimidate the neighbors and their own people. That is true. But the real damage that they do is in these other actions that they take: narcotics trafficking, support of organized crime, human trafficking. I mean, Fidel Castro, before he shut them down because they became known, had schools in Cuba for kidnapping, to teach guerrillas in Latin America how to kidnap people, how to rob banks, how to counterfeit, etc. This is we're dealing again with an organized crime organization, if that's not redundant. And just to conclude, so we can have some time for questions and answers, I can't help but make a comment between the U.S. election and what we've been talking about today. If it is true, as some of the polls say, that 55% of the American people now believe that President Obama will not be reelected, that means that the next president will be a Republican. I recommend to that next president that his Secretary of State, the best person qualified to deal with our foreign policy in this new world, this new war of asymmetric warfare against RICOs, is Rudy Giuliani. So he's my candidate for Secretary of State. Thank you very much.
We're going to begin a period of questions or comments, and I'd rather have questions than not comments, if you don't mind. We have somebody with the microphone. Please. Okay. Dr. Bailey? Hold on a second, Norman.
Thank you very much, Norman Bailey, Institute of World Politics. I want to congratulate Jaime Darrenblum and the Hudson Institute for setting up this extremely interesting panel, and a very timely and important one. Those of us who follow the situation very closely and have done it so for years and spoken about it, written about it, and so on and so forth, are very familiar with the Iranian penetration through Venezuela and into Ecuador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Argentina. A lot of people are not as familiar with Iranian activities in two countries that were briefly mentioned but were not gone into in any detail. And I'm talking about Panama on the one hand and Brazil on the other hand. And I wonder whether any member of the panel would like to say a bit more about either both or one of those two countries. Thank you.
Well, Panama, I think, is important. It doesn't have relations with Iran. It runs them through the embassy in Bogota, but it's become, if you look at Managua now. Okay, they've become an incredibly important transit zone for buying things. And if you look at the number of Iranians that move in and out, one of the interesting things all the ALBA nations have done is remove all visa restrictions on Iranians, so it makes it much more difficult to track their comings and goings. But if you look at what the number of Venezuelan front companies and the number of Iranians in Panama, I think Panama has become a really important point for the purchase of prohibited goods for Iran. I think, as I said, and maybe Otto disagrees or wants to add to this, I think that Brazil's a little bit different because you basically have a more normal state-to-state relationship between Iran and Brazil than you have in any of the ALBA countries. So if you want to have, if you send a vice minister, they meet the vice president. The vice minister, they don't meet the president. If you look at what happens in the ALBA countries, it's Ahmadinejad with that president, and then the orders flow down, and there's no congressional accountability. There's no accountability for how money is spent or if the projects are ever fulfilled or that sort of thing. Brazil actually functions as a real country and follows up on those things. You can find out those that information. Whether you like the relationship or not is different, but I think it's qualitatively different from the ALBA nation.
Just briefly on Brazil. It's true that Brazil has had a relationship with Iran, a commercial relationship. with Iran for many years, and in fact, even with a lot of other countries like Angola, when the United States was having trouble with Angola, Brazil does have what it prides itself as being an independent, certainly commercial policy. But in the last 2 years of the Lula administration, I think that policy became much more political, and they really did reach out to Iran to try to help Iran, in my view, and perhaps this is it's a little unfair, but in my view, to prevent Iran from being sanctioned by the United Nations. I think that policy backfired. I think it embarrassed Lula, and I think that because it didn't work, Lula perhaps made the mistake of believing that he was dealing with an honest person in Ahmadinejad, and as other people have. And I don't see that closeness being replicated today by the Dilma Rousseff government. But who knows?
Hi, Angel Rabasa from the Land Corporation, and I'd like to echo Norman in thanking Jaime and the panelists for an excellent presentation on the state of play of Iran in Latin America and Chavez. And as Norman mentioned, I think for quite some time now, we're all aware of the outlines of Iranian penetration and the options that we have vis-a-vis Chavez. And what interests me is what if there is a major discontinuity? Because the Chavez illness, I think, caught everybody by surprise, and all of a sudden you see all kinds of new possibilities opening in Venezuela. And I recall, going back to the 1970s, when I was involved in Nicaragua with policy on Nicaragua, that one of the factors that led to the downfall of Somoza was his heart attack, because that changed the psychological climate, and then Nicaraguans began to think that it might be possible to change. So with Chavez, assuming that he dies, or even if he doesn't die, if he becomes incapacitated, is not able to project the personality that he has projected so far, what happens? Because you said that the system in Venezuela is a criminal network, and a criminal network is not going to collapse because the one man disappears from the scene. So what do you expect to happen in Venezuela if Chavez is no longer the dominant personality? And by implications, what does that mean for the rest of the issues that you mentioned, Iranian involvement in particular?
Do you want to?
Let's say something. I think one thing briefly is I don't know if it's by design or by accident. One of the things I think Chavez has done incredibly well in the last 3 or 4 years is indebt himself or acquire debts with China, Russia, and other major players that now give them a vested interest in the survival of the Bolivarian project. I think 5 years ago, China didn't care who was there or not. But if you look at the deals now, all right, I'll slow down. that they now have signed with China, they're going to, for the $20 billion that came in last year, they're going to be repaying that at the price of $18 a barrel. That's a very good deal for China. China now has a vested interest in the next government following up on that, which an opposition government would not do. So I think that that going into debt with major powers, either as a strategy or because out of necessity, has greatly strengthened the prospects of the Bolivarian project lasting far beyond one particular person, because now they have a stake in whether that survives or not. I think otherwise it would collapse under its own initiative. I don't think there's anybody in Venezuela that can replace Chavez. But I think the project can survive if other powers outside, external powers, make sure it does.
And if that's correct, if it would collapse, I think that it could break up into a number of, frankly, of what Rudy Giuliani would call families, mafia families fighting for control. You have, people like Diosdado Cabello, who was vice president, who was alleged to have amassed, I'm sure these figures are old, $2 billion. Not a bad salary for a vice president, except that it wasn't his salary. And there's a lot of other people who are going to, they have a lot of motivation in not allowing Venezuela to return to democracy. Number one, because they're living better than they have ever lived in their lives, and they're enjoying it. Number two, because they've committed crimes. Every one of those people has stolen money from the state, and it's against their law. This is what we forget about corruption. It's not just against the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. You know, when somebody commits an act of corruption overseas, they're violating their own laws, and they have violated their own laws. In some cases, they've eliminated their own people, like Danilo Anderson, a prosecutor who was assassinated, and lots of others. So nobody really knows what will happen. But right now, Chavez has appeared to be the glue, like Fidel Castro in Cuba, to keep those warring factions together. Without that glue, who knows?
Perdón, quiero agregar algo a esta pregunta. Hoy no solo son relaciones personales de Ahmadinejad con Chávez, sino que hay convenios fundamentalmente empresarios que pueden perdurar por encima de Chávez. Hoy en Venezuela hay fábricas de distinta naturaleza, fábricas de bicicletas, por ejemplo, donde está el centro de distribución de narcotráfico. Ahí ha instalado una fábrica de bicicletas. Hay una fábrica de tractores y máquinas agrícolas iraníes. Y Irán tiene también explotación de oro en una zona precisamente donde hay explotación de uranio. Quiere decir que los convenios firmados entre estados es muy probable que persistan después de Chávez.
Thank you. My name is Sonia Schott with Global Vision Venezuela. I was wondering why the panel haven't they didn't comment about the UN sanctions against Iran, and what kind of impact does they have in Iran and its intentions in Latin America? Thank you.
I think one of the driving forces for the initial relationship is to evade sanctions. I think that's clear, that they need access to the banking system around the world, and they don't have it, and Venezuela will offer that to them, particularly Panama as well, Bolivia. I think that their necessity to buy things is why you see the Panama connection growing so exponentially. So I think that the UN sanctions have had a significant impact, and I think that Iran is very, very determined to minimize the impact of those. And if you look at the Alba nations, when they go to Tehran last year and they declare they're going to violate the UN embargo and help Iran by whatever means necessary, it's clear that that intention has become reality. None of those countries are going to remotely begin to enforce the sanction. In fact, they'll encourage breaking it. So I think that's one of the fundamental underlying issues for Iran in Latin America. At least I think it's broadened out from there, but I think with their initial impulse or their initial penetration into Iran was largely guided by the sanction, or the ability to break sanctions.
And in fact, Venezuela was helping Iran break the sanctions by shipping reformate, it's called. It's a highly concentrated fuel that you combine with regular gasoline to create more gasoline. And it was discovered, and somebody leaked the shipping documents. It wasn't shipped directly from Venezuela to Iran. They're not stupid. It was shipped to, I forget, another Gulf state country in the Arabian Gulf, and from there to Iran. And it was discovered, and that's what led to the U.S. sanctioning PDVSA. To me, the typical, pardon the redundancy, the typical weak Obama administration sanctions. They should have been a lot tougher, but at least they did, slap the hand of PDVSA.
Andy Yu de Perfil, Argentina. I will make the question in English, although it's directed to the three panelists. And I tend to think that there is always a cause and effect. And we are talking here about effects. And maybe that's the relation with Iran and Latin America. My point here is what caused all this. And I have some points, and I want to know if you agree or not, or what's your vision about this. For many, many years, Latin America was considered the backyard of the United States relation. Is the United States abandoning Latin America? See, for example, that during the last 3 years, we only had a presidential visit to Latin America that only visits 3 countries. The president of Argentina was never invited to the White House. Other situations that we can comment, that there are no ambassadors in this moment in 3 Latin American countries. We're talking about Ecuador, we're talking about Venezuela, we're talking about Bolivia. And there is no really thanking the media or pressure, or we are not seeing nothing. It's no relation. So if you abandon a territory, don't you think that the effect is what we are talking about today? That's the question.
Go ahead.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Isn't it interesting that the 3 countries where we don't have an ambassador are 3 countries where the countries, the presidents of those countries expelled the American ambassador? You know that. I don't think we should be in any hurry to return an ambassador to a country where a Morales, Correa, or Chavez insults the personal representative of the President of the United States and of the people of the United States. We are, believe me, we are very patient, far too much. I mean, I'm being very diplomatic. I'm usually, inside the State Department, I'm not diplomatic. And I would argue that we should not only not send back an ambassador to that country, but maintain the relations under a charge d'affaires. We have a charge d'affaires. Usually charge d'affaires, by the time they reach that level, they're very experienced people and they can handle this very well. You notice it's Rafael Correa, for example, who's desperate now to get an American ambassador. He announced that the United States was sending an ambassador back. If I was in the State Department, I would have denied it. But I'm not in the State Department. Not yet. Let me give you an example. When we had a foreign policy under Reagan, when Daniel Ortega expelled an American diplomat, the Reagan administration did what almost all administrations do, and what in fact the Obama administration did when our ambassador in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela was expelled. We expelled their ambassador. Okay, tit for tat. You know what Reagan did? Not only did he expel the Nicaraguan ambassador, they closed every single Nicaraguan consulate in the United States that was being used for espionage, for fundraising, and for lobbying against U.S. policy in Central America. Daniel Ortega got the message. You know, this is, I think, the way that a superpower needs to act when insulted. Now, have we abandoned Latin America? Well, certainly this administration has paid no attention to Latin America, but it is a traditional complaint of Latin Americans for many decades to say that we abandoned Latin America. I mean, it doesn't matter how many presidents go to Latin America or how many policies, they always say we've abandoned Latin America. Let me tell you something. There's another side to that coin. Latin America has also abandoned the United States. Why? When the average American turns on the television set and very occasionally sees the face of Latin America, what face is it? It's Hugo Chavez, it's Morales, it's Castro, it's Correa, usually insulting the United States. I mean, when I'm talking about the political, I mean, and it is true, by the way, our media has a lot of responsibility because they don't cover Latin America unless it's a volcano, an earthquake, or a revolution. You know, or something. Really, honestly, what else do they cover? Very little about Latin America. A Democratic, pro-American president of Latin America came when I was in the State Department, came to Washington, went to visit the Washington Post. They go and they asked them the same question. Don't you think that the Bush administration has neglected Latin America, has ignored Latin America? And he says to the Post, how many correspondents do you have in Latin America? And they said, 2. And so you have 2 correspondents to cover this continent of 500 million people. He said, at least the Bush administration has an office in every country. You know, there's a lot, we do need to pay more attention to Latin America, but the Latin Americans also can help themselves a great deal. I thought you were going to say actually that the conditions that create the Chavezes and the Moraleses and the Correas and the Castros and the others are really something that has to be addressed. And there I agree with you. Otherwise, it could happen. What's happening in those countries, the demagoguery, these people are responding to a need that at least 50% of the population feels.
Can I just add one thing? One of my, me siento aludido por lo de los medios. No, it's lo de los medios. No, it's true. There's no longer a budget to keep.
You're forgiven.
There's no longer the budget to keep people overseas, and it's tragic. I think the impact not only in Latin America but around the world is important. But I think that one thing that frustrates me in dealing with Latin America across the board is that there's this constant thing, what about the United States? And my answer is, what about the Latin Americans? Where's Brazil when Chavez is doing what he's doing on human rights issues? Where's the response to all the multiple offenses of the Correa government and the fact that the FARC funded his campaign? Absolute silence. Absolute silence. And I say if they really want to make a difference, yes, the United States should be much more outspoken. Yes, we should be much more engaged. But Latin America itself has been silent on the silencing of the press. Where's the marches for freedom of the press? When the narcos, and I was in Colombia covering it, when the narcos were killing the periodistas, the journalists there were massive protests around the place. All of that's gone. They can silence the press legally, nothing happens. They put the opposition in jail, nothing happens. So I say Latin America has a tremendous responsibility itself for what's happening there and the silence around the world on that's happening there.
Voy a agregar algo y no me voy a meter en política ni de Estados Unidos ni de toda Latinoamérica. Obviamente que Brasil no es el mismo antes con Lula que hoy con Dilma. Lula tenía una relación con Ahmadinejad diferente, hasta Brasil se había propuesto como mediador entre Irán y la Comisión por temas de atómicos. Y hoy Dilma se ha separado abruptamente en la relación con Ahmadinejad. Pero volviendo a la pregunta inicial, es si uno analiza los efectos, pero habría que revisar cuáles son las causas. Tenemos que entender que Irán hoy tiene una ofensiva hacia todo el mundo, no solamente Latinoamérica. Irán entiende a Estados Unidos como su enemigo principal y entra en todos los continentes, en Europa también, de diferente manera, porque además tiene la inteligencia de saber de qué manera debe de entrar a cada continente. No se maneja de la misma manera en cada uno de ellos. Latinoamérica, como hablábamos antes, es un lugar muy fácil para entrar porque además consigue la misma ideología, pero las inversiones que realiza hoy en Latinoamérica, incluso en Argentina, fíjense que yo comenté la situación judicial que tiene Argentina con Irán. Sin embargo, Irán está pretendiendo en estos momentos entrar con inversiones en Argentina de la mano de Venezuela. Está intentando instalar una fábrica en la provincia de Buenos Aires que se llama Venirautos. Es una alianza entre Venezuela e Irán. Yo no sé si alguno conoce una marca de autos iraníes o que tenga la intención de poner fábricas en distintos países. En la provincia de Buenos Aires intenta ponerlo. Así que busca hacer una ofensiva, si no es diplomática, comercial, para poder tener base en todos los países de Latinoamérica, simplemente por ese motivo, para tener presencia en todos los continentes en contra de su enemigo principal, que es Estados Unidos.
La señora aquí a la...
I'm a little fuzzy on the mined uranium embargoes. Can any of you all speak to uranium going to Iran and what's going on there? There seems to be a pretty high trafficking out of Latin America. What's the deal on that? Thank you.
Well, I don't know if anybody agrees with me on the panel on this one. I think that there's not a great deal going on with uranium. I think there are a lot of other minerals that are revolve around coltan that are of much more significant importance. Now, I don't think Iran has a huge pressing need for uranium at this time. But if you look at there are strategic minerals being extracted, and I think a lot of the talk about uranium is a smokescreen while they can do multiple other things, especially if you look at the Venezuela-Colombia border where the coltan is being mined and the thorianite and the other things are very useful for missile construction, high heat resistance for missile construction. I think that those are probably more important, more strategic for Iran right now than looking for Iran, other than uranium. Is there an embargo against it?
I don't know. I don't know of an embargo specifically against uranium.
Okay, one final question.
I was just wondering your opinion about how our foreign policy has come back and basically kicked us in the rear end. For decades now, we have been installing dictators in Latin America, such as Pinochet. Our CIA has been there and was behind that. Our backing of the Contras in Nicaragua. In Iran, the Shah. And at the time, it may have served our purposes for the then Cold War, but I would like to know if you think that we should keep pursuing these sorts of policies. And if that's why we have that kind of reception in South America. And also on the issue of sanctions, do you really think having sanctions against all these countries is really a way to turn them to the right way? If we were dealing with them, they're going to turn
Sorry, hold the microphone a little closer.
with the sanctions, I mean, they're not being able to get money. Of course they're going to go to criminal elements, whether it's gun running, drugs. And then on the whole drug issue, if this is indeed funding so much of this terrorism, what do you think about the idea of overturning what some call the failed war on drugs?
How much time do we have? I mean, that's a lot of questions. I feel on the Contras, I can tell you that we backed the right people. The Sandinistas were killing. I went to camps in Honduras where there were refugees from Nicaragua early on whose families had been killed by the Sandinistas. They're the ones who created, talk about cause and effect. The Sandinistas created the Contras. We came in much later with insufficient money, but they kept fighting anyway, and they won. At least they forced an election, which a lot of people in this country thought that the Sandinistas were going to win because they believed the Sandinista propaganda that they were popular, where guess what? They were not popular. But the result, by the way, was a democracy. And 20 years later, Daniel Ortega was elected president of Nicaragua, and we have to live with him. We may not like him, but we live with him. Had it not been for the Contras, Nicaragua would be another Cuba today. The Shah of Iran, that was a little before my time, but I urge you to read Jean Kirkpatrick's monograph on dictatorships and double standards. There really is a difference between authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes. The Shah, the Castros, the Marxist-Leninist leaders around the world, the Nazis, the totalitarians, almost without exception, have had to be overthrown from without and with a great deal of violence. Russia, we were very lucky. Or the Soviet Union. Luck is when opportunity meets preparation, and we were lucky to have a strategy. But as far as the narcotics, I mean, that's a domestic question. Whether it's not a foreign policy question. Whether we should do away or with what do you call it, legalize narcotics trafficking. It's certainly something that has to be dealt with. It's not working. The policy is not working. It has to be changed. But to what, I'm not going to make any announcements.
One thing I think you do have to recognize is that particularly where I'm most familiar with is Bolivia. It was the corruption and the failure of the process to really democratize, that to go to rotating between two parties, three parties that would always split the vote, that led to Evo Morales becoming president, without a doubt. There were deep-seated multiple problems with that country and with the distribution of wealth and with many other things that led to Evo to winning the presidency. The same can be said in Ecuador. Ecuador had multiple failures of the political class that were operating through a democracy where they just sort of switched chairs, and then corruption was deeply endemic. I think the issue is that the new Bolivarian revolution that was supposed to end all that, in fact, became much worse. And I think that whether that's our policy biting us in the butt after all these years, I don't know. But I think that, yes, the historic responsibility for the leaders of the democracies is great in creating the openings for these people to become elected. I think the great tragedy is, instead of seizing the historic moments that were offered them, this revolution has chosen to become much more radicalized, much worse, and much more criminalized than those that were before them.
There's one more thing that we should. There's a danger in blaming or giving credit to the United States for things that go bad or go well in Latin America or anywhere in the world. I mean, let's face it. I think it was President Dualde of Argentina who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. It was absolutely right. He said, "Our problems are homemade, and our solutions have to be homemade." The problems of Argentina. Argentina is a perfect example of a country that 100 years that should be so much better off. 100 years ago, Argentina had the 5th highest per capita income in the world. Today is, let's say, 10 years ago, in 2001, when I became Assistant Secretary of State, we were preparing to ship food to Argentina because that's how bad the situation was. It never came to that. The problems of Argentina and the problems of Bolivia and Ecuador and Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua are primarily the result of those people making mistakes, or maybe trying to do the wrong thing and coming up with, or the right thing and coming up with a wrong solution. But we should not take on our shoulders the blame or the credit for everything that goes good or bad in the world.
We thank you.
Agrego, solo para agregar un dato más para el conocimiento de lo que ocurre en Latinoamérica y el delito y el crimen organizado. Quizá no todos lo saben, pero en los últimos tiempos se detuvo a una banda de narcotráfico en Curazao, cuyo producto, el resultado de todo su comercio, era exclusivamente para las aldeas del sur del Líbano de Hezbollah, que es el brazo armado de Irán para cometer los atentados terroristas.
Well, it's got to get to the end. We thank you very much for having joined us this afternoon, and let's give our extraordinary panel a final round of applause.
Thank you.
What's that?